To the further annoyance of the constable, King Juan fell in love with his young wife. Assured by a fortune teller that he would live to be 90, and finding himself still handsome and charming in his 40s, he gave himself up to love and to gluttony, without consulting Don Alvaro as to his comings and goings. The queen began to feel for him the affection that weak and likable men often inspire in strong-minded women. Pious, energetic, and incapable of compromise where any principle was involved, she threw her influence on the side of the nobles who were constantly plotting for the downfall of the favorite, even after he crushed them at the first battle of Olmedo. The suspicion that de Luna had attempted to poison her at the time of the Infanta Isabel's birth urged her on to hasten his fall. 3 years after the birth of the Princess Isabel, she brought forth her son, Alfonso, and while he was still in the womb, she accomplished her desire. The murder of Don Alfonso Perez de Vivero gave her the opportunity she sought. He was the king's messenger, but Don Alvaro, angered because he had forsaken his party for the queen's, had him thrown out of a window on Good Friday afternoon in 1453. This conduct agreed so well with the popular impression that the constable was a Catholic in name only and a dabbler in black magic. A dabbler. Just a dabbler into black magic, that the indignation against him was extreme. The queen made use of it to complete her ascendancy over the king. She induced him to have Don Alvaro seized and taken to Valladolid, where a council of his enemies was waiting to pass judgment upon him. At the crucial moment, some of the conversos, whom he had raised to power, joined the party of the queen. Their ingratitude was decisive. De Luna was an unruffled and confident. De Luna was as unruffled and confident in misfortune as he had been in power. He knew that if he could talk with the king for 5 minutes, his personal charm would gain a pardon. It had on other occasions. No one knew better than he how difficult it was for Don Juan to punish anyone. In fact, de Luna had once advised him never to speak with any man whom he had condemned. The queen reminded her husband of that excellent counsel when he thought of receiving the constable in audience. Seconded by those who feared the vengeance of Don Alvaro if he returned to power, she adjured him in the name of Castile, of their love, of their children, of the God so long defied by de Luna, to prove himself a true king by administering strict justice. Twice during the trial, Juan is said to have signed an order for the release of his friend, and to have been shamed out of sending it by the queen, who remained at his side night and day. When he ratified the sentence of the court, his tears fell upon the paper. Meanwhile, in Valladolid, that drab city, preparations for the execution had been completed with almost indecent haste, and at 8 o'clock on the morning of June 2nd, a crowd was gathering in the Plaza Mayor before a huge scaffold covered with black velvet, surmounted by a crucifix and a block, against this sable background. Thumbing the edge of the great sword of the kings of Castile stood the tall figure of an executioner, masked, silent, wrapped in robes of scarlet. The plaza was almost filled with peasants, cattle herders, gaily dressed hidalgos, whom had ridden from far places to see their master's undoing. A trumpet sounded, and down the principal street came a little procession to the sound of muffled kettle drums. First, a party-colored herald with gaudy cap and tabard proclaimed in a loud voice the high crimes of Don Álvaro de Luna. Next, 2 ranks of men-at-arms in leather jerkins and cuirasses, and finally, mounted on a mule, the imperturbable Grandmaster, wearing high heels. Wearing high-heeled shoes with diamond buckles. High-heeled shoes with diamond buckles, and muffled to the chin in a long Castilian cloak, while his confessor rode behind him. The condemned dismounted, gazed serenely about at the brilliant assembly of his foes, and the idly curious smiled as if to say that one could expect no more from human nature, and with a firm step went up to meet the man in scarlet. Never had he looked more noble and gracious than when he raised his fine head and gazed thoughtfully out of his dark eyes over the heads of the people. A murmur of admiration and pity rippled through the crowd, whereat Don Álvaro placed his hand over his heart and bowed to them with grave gallantry. After another word with his confessor, he loosened the tassel cord at his neck and handed his cloak to his page, Morales, revealing on his breast a sword and cockle shell of Santiago, emblems of the great crusade that he had sacrificed to avarice and ambition. He handed the page his hat, a ring as a keepsake. If he glanced down the narrow street to see whether the king's messenger was coming, if he began to doubt the promises of his astrologers, he betrayed no uneasiness when he turned again to the spectators and in a resonant voice wished happiness and prosperity to the king and people of Castile. The sunlight sparkled on his coal black hair, and on the jewels at his feet and his waist, on the newly ground steel of the sword of justice. Don Álvaro casually examined the block and the sword from his bosom, a black ribbon, handed it to the executioner for the binding of his hands. This done, he knelt before the crucifix and prayed with fervor. A silence like the dying of the wind in a field of wheat fell over the murmuring crowd. The Grand Master was placing his head on the block. The man in red made a panther-like movement. There was a flash of steel. Cries and shrieks burst from the plaza. The head rolled in the dust. Castile for the king, Don Juan and his wife, Lady Isabel. It was the young queen's hour of victory, but the chalice of her triumph was bitter, for the king suffered the remorse of the imaginative, and all the rest of his miserable days passed in self-reproaches for the doom of his friend. I in the birth of his son Alfonso. November 15th, 1454. Left him unconsoled. He died the following July after a reign of 48 indolent years, moaning, "Would to God I had been born the son of a mechanic." Instead of the son of a king. He had encouraged art and literature. He had given power and privileges to the Jews. He was father to a princess in whom his intellect and her mother's will compounded to form greatness. History has remembered little more of him. His magnificent tomb is in the Cartuja de Miraflores, 2 miles from Burgos. After his funeral and the coronation of the new king, Enrique IV, the queen withdrew from the court with her 2 children and made her residence in the small castle of Arevalo. In Old Castile, Alfonso was an infant in the cradle. The Infanta Isabel was a self-possessed little blonde girl of 3 years, with wide shoulders and sturdy legs, who regarded the world frankly and analytically through large blue eyes in which there were tiny streaks and specks of gold and green. The melancholy that had fallen upon the queen when Isabel was born became habitual. After the king's death, she was seldom free from illness, never from anxiety. Her allowance from her stepson Enrique, who had never liked her much, came so irregularly that the little family was sometimes reduced to the bare necessities, almost to actual want. But as all other resources failed her, the pious queen turned more than ever to the solace of religion, and spent what remained of her superb will in the service of her children. Isabel remembered her lying in bed, ill, in white mourning garments, weeping for the king, in the chapel, kneeling in reverence before the uplifted host. The child remembers something vague but terrifying about the execution of Álvaro de Luna, for it was much talked about and sung about in popular ballads. She recalled being told at the age of 6 that King Enrique was arranging for her marriage to Prince Fernando, the 5-year-old second son of the King of Aragon. Fernando. The name was like a bell chiming in a far country of romance. It was odd to be betrothed of a prince that one had never seen. At Arevalo, Isabel formed her first friendship, one that lasted until the day of her death. Beatriz de Bobadilla was a child of her own age, daughter of the governor of the castle. Beatriz was dark and emotional, while Isabel was fair, reserved, and strangely mature. They became inseparable. They played games together in the enclosed garden of the Alcazar. They learned to read by the bedside of the queen. They approached the altar in the chapel together to receive their first Holy Communion. Sometimes they rode with the governor and his troops to the little walled town into the flat, checkered country, where fields of wheat and saffron extended one after another as far as one could see, the wheat almost the color of Isabel's hair, and the saffron very fragrant on the wind. Cows and horses grazed in the pastures along the meandering Araja. Beyond the green places lay a flat desert, stark and treeless and full of unknown things to be feared. The lights and shadows alternated on this level plateau in broad undulating bars, like the waves of a great dark sea. Sometimes they rode as far as Medina del Campo, where the greatest fair in Spain was held 3 times a year, and merchants came from all over southern Spain to buy choice Castilian wools and grains, and blooded steers and horses and mules from Andalusia. There were cavaliers from Aragon, sailors from Catalonia on the east coast, mountaineers from Guipúzcoa on the north, turbaned Moors from Granada in the south, blue-eyed Castilian farmers, bearded Jews in gabardines. peasants from Provence and Languedoc, sometimes even an Englishman or a German. The people interested her, but not so much as the horses. Before Isabel was 10, she scorned the mule that etiquette ordained for women and children, and kept her seat on a spirited horse. Days in the saddle made her hard, straight, resourceful, fearless. Indifferent to fatigue, contemptuous of pain, a vigorous girl with delicate pink complexion, a firm, prudent mouth, a lower jaw a trifle heavy, indicating unusual energy and will. Page 8. She became a skilled huntress, commencing with hares and deer, but later following the black wild boar, and on one occasion slaying a good-sized bear with her javelin. Her brother Alfonso learned also to handle a sword and to tilt with lances. Isabel grew up without a knowledge of Latin, but her education in other respects was sound and well-balanced. She learned to speak Castilian musically and with elegance, and to write it with a touch of distinction. She studied grammar and rhetoric, painting, poetry, history, and philosophy. She embroidered intricate Moorish designs on velour and cloth of gold, and illuminated prayers in Gothic characters on leaves of parchment. A missal that she painted and some banners and ornaments for the altar in her chapel are in the cathedral at Granada. She had inherited a love for music and poetry. She read her father's favorite poet, Juan de Mena, and probably a Spanish translation of Dante. Her tutors, having studied at Salamanca University, must have given her at second hand the philosophy of Aristotle, on which St. Thomas Aquinas had built the great synthesis that was the foundation of medieval teaching. Some notion of how science was taught at the period may be had from a philosophical and allegorical novel called The Visión Deleitable, or Vision Deleitable, written by the Bachelor de la Torre about 1461 for the instruction of Prince Charles of Vienna, Isabel's second fiancé. I perceive that motion is the cause of heat, says the young hero, and goes on to discuss why there are perpendicular lines on the sun, what makes the wind blow, why climates differ, why materials are different, what causes the sensations of smell, taste, hearing, why some plants are large and others small, the properties of medicine, and all this sugar-coated in the form of a novel. The tragedies of Seneca were known in Spain. One of the first books published after the introduction of printing in Isabel's reign was a translation of Plutarch's Lives by Alonso de Palencia. He was a diplomat, a scholar, and one of the chief contemporary chroniclers of the reign of Enrique IV and the first part of Isabel's. Another by the same author was Josephus's history. Spanish versions of the Odyssey and the Aeneid were popular in the court of Isabel's brother. Books of medicine and surgery and anatomical charts were fairly common in a country where the Jews had long excelled in the healing art. From singing the cancioneros that had been so dear to her father, Isabel evoked from the past the heroic story of her crusading ancestors. And from the chronicles of her own time, there unrolled before her keen intelligence and strong imagination a picture of the fascinating and terrifying world into which she had been born. She was a king's daughter and the half-sister of a king, and there were certain inevitable questions that she must have asked her mother. What manner of man was Don Enrique IV, and what was he doing to bring back the glories of Saint Fernando and Alfonso the Wise, and heal the scars that the gemmed boots of Don Alvaro had left upon the face of a Castile weary of wars and feuds? His Majesty occasionally rode to Arevalo to visit his relatives. Isabel remembered his coming there one day with 2 cavaliers, the Marqués of Villena and his brother Don Pedro Girón. These gentlemen, she learned afterwards from her mother, were the king's closest companions, his criados, who advised him in everything and who therefore were the 2 most powerful persons in the realm. Perhaps that was why they cut a more magnificent figure than King Enrique himself. They wore fine silks bordered with cloth of gold, large and brilliant jewels, heavy gold chains cunningly wrought by smiths in Córdoba. The king looked shabby beside them. Loose-jointed, tall, and awkward, he wore his long woolen coat in a slovenly way, and instead of the boots that Castilian cavaliers wore, had his small, delicate feet shod in buskins, like those of the Moors, with mud on them, so that they looked all the more peculiar on the ends of his long legs. But his face puzzled the little princess even more than his queer clothes and his familiar way of speaking to the servants. His skin was very white and rather puffy. His eyes were blue, somewhat too large, and somehow different from the eyes of other people. His nose was wide, flat, and decidedly crooked, the result, it was said, of a fall he had as a boy. At the top of that prominent organ were 2 vertical furrows into which the bushy royal eyebrows curled up in a most peculiar manner. His beard was shaggy, with auburn streaks in it, and stuck out so oddly and abruptly that it made his face in profile look concave. But it was the eyes that one kept looking at, and wondering about. There was a strange look of grievance and bewilderment in them. An inquietude that vaguely disturbed one. What did they remind her of? His chaplain, who wrote an eulogy of him after his death, recorded that Enrique's aspect was fierce, like that of a lion, that by its very look strikes terror to all beholders. But it did not remind the chronicler Palencia of a lion at all. It reminded him of one of those monkeys that Isabel had seen in a wooden cage at the fair at Medina del Campo. His eyes glittered and roved about and looked ashamed, just like a monkey's. The Stuttgart portrait seems to bear out this impression of Alonso de Palencia. His Majesty talked of one thing and another, sometimes turning for confirmation of what he said to the Marqués of Villena, who nodded or put in a suave word in his slow drawl. This gentleman, he had the good or evil fortune to be born later, would have been called a self-made man, for in the time of King Juan he was one Juan Pacheco, a page introduced at court by Don Álvaro de Luna. Though a professing Christian, he was one of many with Jewish blood in their veins who owed their prosperity to the great constable. On both sides, he was descended from the Jew Rui Capon. But with other conversos of the court, he had requited his benefactor by helping to overthrow him. Oops! Prince Enrique, whose elevation was thus hastened, rewarded Pacheco by making him Marquess of Villena and his his intimate companion and advisor. Of the three men, the Marquess was the most likable because there was a twinkle in his shrewd eyes, and his beard and mustache were positively fascinating. So ingeniously had they been curled, so ingeniously, so ingeniously. Besides, he smelled delightfully of ambergris. He had a long aquiline nose, quite hooked in the middle and pointed at the tip, and somewhat too near the base of it, a narrow mouth with full lips, giving a curiously cherubic expression to the whole face. On either side of the mouth, a carefully waxed and twisted mustache drooped somewhat dejectedly for a short distance, and then of a sudden turned up and up into two jaunty and devil-may-care points. The Marquess could be charming when he wanted to be, and on this particular occasion he made himself most agreeable. His brother, Don Pedro Giron, was also of that numerous class of Castilians known as conversos, or new Christians. He must have made at least some pretense of being a Catholic, else he could hardly have attained to the grand mastership of the illustrious military order of Calatrava, founded by two Cistercian monks and consecrated to the rule of Saint Benedict. He was a sleek, well-fed man, probably a sensual and passionate man. He hardly glanced at the queen, hardly, but his eyes returned from time to time to gloat upon the fresh blonde beauty of the young princess, and his look was one of those under which a woman was almost a sensation of being forcibly disrobed, under which a woman has almost the sensation of being forcibly disrobed. After the king and the two cavaliers had gone, Isabel found her mother weeping. In her apartment, she may have divined that the royal visit in some way concerned her, but she was too young to be told of the indecent proposal that Don Pedro had made on another occasion to the queen, and at the instigation, so he said, of Enrique himself. Enrique the Liberal, he was called on his accession in 1454, and liberal he was in more than one sense of the word. There was a certain grandeur in his contempt for all practical and mercenary considerations. A favorite had only to ask him for money or land belonging to the crown, and he complied graciously. He ordered castles, monuments, and monasteries built wherever and whenever the fancy seized him. He signed schedules and important state papers without even reading them. He gave his friends orders on the exchequer, leaving the sum blank for the beneficiaries to fill in to suit themselves. And when a conscientious treasurer objected, Enrique silenced him. When a with one of his royal aphorisms. Quote, instead of accumulating treasures like private persons, a king ought to spend them for the welfare of his subjects. I give to my enemies to make them my friends, and give to my friends to keep them from becoming my enemies. Unquote! It was simple, very simple, and it must be said for him that he was as generous with the property of others as he was with his own. Having acquired the vast Castilian estates of King Juan of Aragon as security for a loan, he gave most of them to his friend Pacheco. Pacheco. The Marquess smiled more cherubically than ever. But there were several other needy deservers who thought the king's generosity had been misplaced. Oops! However, a king with such a philosophy was sure to have friends as long as his funds held out.